Well, thank you, Juhana, thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me. And this has been very interesting to think about. In one sense, it's slightly awkward for me discussing the Nordic model being Australian, but there's a lot of really important general points here: political philosophy and public policy. One of the things I'll assume about the Nordic model is that it has historically been economically successful and that it's normatively justifiable and worthy. What I'm going to do is, I've basically just used the book that was here before, the Nordic model, as my main source, and been thinking about what Juhana is going to say and has said in the past. And also, for those interested, some of what I've got to say, a broad survey of sort of political philosophy can be found in Kimlicka. I take the most important issues here. Actually, it's interesting listening to you talk there because there's a lot more connections between what you've said and what I was about to say here than what I initially realised. Right, so there's some important issues here. One is the relationship between individual interests and the public interest. Right? And in this case, it's commitment to the public economy. And secondly, the dangers. I mean, one of the things I want to do, Buskley was talking about before whether or not I was going to support or challenge. I think in a large sense there's a support for a lot of what Juhana has to say. Part of the challenge here that I want to put is how we bring about certain kinds of reforms without undermining what's good about the Nordic model. And I think that's part of what you're concerned about too. All right, so I'll say a little bit about the role of the market in that as well. Okay, I should also say, I was watching the news last night and trying to, and there was a report about pension payments covered by the working population supposedly not covering the actual pension costs, but I'm told by Juhana that that's a little bit of a beat up, but no, that's right, isn't it? It's not exactly what's going on. But anyway, the topic was exactly what we're talking about here. Right, so what do I mean by the Nordic model? Well, from the Anglo-sphere, it's often seen as a puzzle. How these economies can prosper despite weak economic incentives due to high taxation, generous social security systems and an egalitarian distribution of income, or relatively egalitarian. So, I mean, it has often been a puzzle, I think, from those of us in the English-speaking world. And for many people, I suppose on the left of politics, in somewhere like Australia, it's been a model that people look towards as something to aspire towards. The Nordic model here, as far as the report goes, embraces both globalisation and the welfare state, and the argument is that security offered by collective mechanisms for sharing risk has been instrumental in enhancing a favourable attitude to globalisation and competition. So supposedly the virtue of the Nordic model is its ability to reconcile risks and uncertainties with openness and a market economy. Right, so one of the things you might ask about here is what are some of the philosophical underpinnings of it? Somebody might be, I've got a couple of things. You might actually think part of what's going on here is an egalitarianism. In the report itself, it talks a lot about egalitarianism, all right, and egalitarian. Sometimes the spirit of it seems to be social democratic, or, well, I don't know if it's a social democrat, but going back to Marx, and the famous saying that from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. You might try to justify or see what's going on with the Nordic model in terms of utilitarianism, given the emphasis on the increase in social resources. But I actually think much of what's going on here is really prioritarian. Right? So Rawls famously, Rawls doesn't talk about prioritarianism, but he gives an account of distributed justice. One of his principles is the difference principle, which, I've got a rather complicated version of it up there, which is what's in a theory of justice. But the idea is roughly to make the worst off better off. Now, contemporary political philosophers don't call that egalitarian, they call it prioritarian. And I think there's a lot of prioritarianism. Well, what's underpinning a lot of the ideals in that book and the understanding generally of the Nordic model is prioritarian. This is in a sense controversial. But certainly I think the Nordic model's combination of market-oriented reforms combined with the provision of universal welfare does make it seem rather more prioritarian rather than straightforwardly egalitarian. What I want to do is just, as a matter of contrast, and I suppose it says something about what's going on where I come from. I want to contrast it with something, a model, what I'm going to call, and other people have called, virtue parsimony. Right? And I'll just say a little bit about that in a minute. But why I do this is because I think it's the other end of the spectrum. And this is the idea that our models should rely on as little what we call virtue or social commitment as possible. Right? So one of the things about the Nordic model as it's presented and how as it's been understood is that it relies on social commitment on part of the general population to the goals of society, to the public economy. And in a way you were talking about that before, about the danger of certain kinds of market incentives not only being demeaning but I think also undermining people's social commitment. So the model I'm calling virtue parsimony, and you can find descriptions of this amongst economists like Geoffrey Brennan and amongst Albert Hirschman, who some of you might know from some of his historical writings, talks about parsimony. Right? Now this is one, as I say, it's a different model of the relationship of the citizens of a nation to the goals of society, if you want to put it that way. And this is a principle of institutional design, that if we're faced with a choice between two or more forms of institutional design, not all other things being equal, we should prefer the one that requires less virtue input from its citizens to the one that requires more. Before, when Juhana was talking about what people find demeaning about some kinds of the use of the market and economic incentives, it's related to this in the sense that, I mean, not only do people find it demeaning, many people might find it demeaning, but it's the idea that we can't expect anything more from people than, you know, the less we rely on social commitment, the less we rely on virtue understood as a commitment to the social whole, a commitment to the public economy, the better off we are. Now clearly something like the Nordic model hasn't functioned like that. So when people say and are concerned about certain kinds of social reforms that are going on that involve the market, much of it I think is not just that it's demeaning, but also that it has a model of institutional design based on virtue parsimony. And I think, as I say, this can be seen as a possible response to the problem in political philosophy of how we balance the relationship between individual virtue and our political institutions. And in general, is it a good idea to prefer those institutions that demand anticipating individuals' good intentions, that is a virtue-rich input? Or alternatively, in the interest of human flourishing, should we prefer those institutions that are thrifty or parsimonious with respect to the virtue inputs demanded of those who inhabit them, even to demand no virtue inputs at all? Right, so the question's fairly fundamental, because this is something that hasn't been part of political thinking up here. So the principle is usually accompanied by two glosses. The primary reason for employing this principle is that virtue is scarce, and if virtue is scarce, the less we rely on good intentions, then the more likely we are to succeed. And all that I mean by virtue here, I mean, I'm not invoking some kind of virtue ethics, I'm just meaning commitment to the social, to the public good. Now, all right, so this is background. I'll come back to this idea about virtue parsimony in a little while, but the challenge to the Nordic model, will there be, I left that there when I was putting this together, will there be sufficient workers to cover the cost of those receiving social welfare and related government services? And it raises questions about the obligations of the individual to the public economy. I mean, that's already been said by both Ruskili and Juhana. All right. Now, two possible responses to this. I'm going to call it retirement deferral, and then it's probably an economic term, and activation measures, retraining. So two of the policies that have been put forward are these two. I should say that the latter is probably in some ways more socially controversial, because if you think about the distinction between omission and commission, I mean, one thing, the retirement deferral just relies that it's much more a policy of omission, in the sense that you just omit, or people can't get a pension and whatever until much later. Whereas activation measures involve commitment or commission, in the sense that it requires, may well require some form of coercion. And for that reason, there are at least politically more controversial. They may well be morally very little difference in terms of what they expect of people in terms of their commitment to the public economy, but certainly forcing people to do something is much more difficult than withdrawing something from them. Right, okay, now as it says in the report, this is the report that Juhana was one of the co-authors of. We're emphasised at a high rate of labour, you can read that, I won't read all that. But basically the point is that lengthening working careers must go hand in hand with increasing longevity. So that's what's being put forward. Okay. As I say, any such retirement deferral is obviously controversial since it places pressure on one of the elements that many see as central to the Nordic model, namely a safe and financially secure retirement that begins in one's 60s. All right, now, I'll just go back. It raises general questions about the obligations of the individual citizens to the public economy, and all right. One of the interesting things about this, though, is it does require the actual retirement deferral and getting people to agree to it and legitimating it across society as a whole. It does require some commitment on the part of members of society to those common goals. For forcing it without commitment will undermine some central features of the Nordic model, namely individuals' commitment to the social whole. Should also notice, in a sense, that these retirement deferrals and expecting people to accept it on the grounds of the good of the public economy, in many ways is at odds with or is 180 degrees from the ideals underneath virtue parsimony, which suggests that people are, virtue is rather scarce. Right, now I've just got two assumptions that, I'm not an economist, I don't actually know much about the demographics of the Nordic countries or Finland or whatever. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to accept that that's the case, and I think there's good reasons for accepting it. One is, two assumptions, first is the retirement assumption. Economic circumstances are such that we do need help we do need to increase the retirement age. Right, let's just say that's true. Now, you might have some empirical arguments to say that's false, but I think for the point of view of this is that's an assumption. Right? And as a matter of fact, I'd be loath to challenge it anyway, given it seems highly plausible given the demographics. I should say, just personally, I don't have a problem with the retirement age for myself being extended, but the sort of work I do is such that it's not physically demanding being a philosopher. And so on. But many people, I think it could be it's dangerous to start generalising from your own circumstance, obviously. And I think that it's not true for many people who have jobs that are very physically demanding, dangerous, mind-numbingly boring, or stressful. So David Miller, I was reminded when you were talking, years and years ago in a book called Social Justice, talks about dirty, dangerous work. And he talks about compensating. That seems to have fallen off the political agenda a lot in the last 20 years. But it is something I think you've raised that's worth talking about in this context, because it's very different raising the retirement age for somebody who's working a particularly stressful or dangerous job than it is for people in work like, say, high engaging, blissfully or whatever. And the assumption of harm, I'll assume that extending the time before one can retire is a harm or a bad-making feature of a state of affairs. All right. So that's the other assumption, that this is a harm. A couple of mitigating factors about the harm. One is that we are living longer and we are fitter to an older age, so the extent to which working longer is a harm is probably less than it might once have been 100 years ago. The other thing is that the other harm mitigation point I want to make is that those working in stressful, physically demanding work could be reallocated, reassigned to work that is less harmful in those respects. All right, so some of the problems we have, and this is just a reiteration of some things that were said by Leslie earlier. How do we justify the imposition of this harm? On what philosophical grounds might one object? Can we object within a social democratic framework? Do we need to provide another conceptual normative framework in order to justify the imposition of this burden? All right. Well, one, and it was mentioned before, that the ownership objection. How am I going for time? What time have I got?
It'll be fine.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. One objection that Juhana raised before was what I'll call the ownership objection. And that's the idea is to reframe the problem in terms of the ownership of labour. Now you can imagine a number of different objections. You can imagine a liberal objection to social expectations of contribution and the social coercion involved in a social democratic project. You can imagine certain kinds of social subjections because you might think from a socialist point of view that increasing the period of work involves increasing the period of exploitation and oppression. And you can imagine utilitarian objections, all right? I mean, they would be empirical in nature, and the idea would be that somehow that this retirement, increasing the retirement age, somehow has bad consequences for the economy as a whole, or the overall sum of utility. But, I mean, I think the utilitarian arguments seem to be going the other way, and I think that's partly what was being said before. Right, so one way of conceptualising what has been proposed is to think of it as a call upon our labour that we already own. And all right, so you might think that this is morally illegitimate because it involves requisitioning labour that we own, and why does the government have a right to obtain or requisition that labour? So that's an objection that was raised just before. But here's some questions about, is ownership of labour the best way to understand the issue? If ownership is an appropriate way to understand it, then does that mean that requisitioning by government of some of the labour is illegitimate? To what extent is opting out a possibility? And if citizens have these responsibilities, then what rights follow? So, I mean, I'm going to weave these questions through the rest of this discussion. The first question here, is ownership of labour the best way to understand the issue? I don't actually think it is, but I'll come back to the end. And there's a question about the extent to which we own our labour. But I will come back to it. So I'll look at the second question. If ownership is an appropriate way to understand the problem, then does that mean requisition by government of some of the labour is legitimate? Well, it sort of reminds me of questions about taxation. I mean, we're talking about labour here, but similar arguments go on about taxation of property and people's work. And you find a discussion of, this idea expressed by Milton Friedman in the book Free to Choose, Milton and Rose Friedman. They talk about Tax Freedom Day, and that people should celebrate Tax Freedom Day. And this is the day for Americans when they stop working for government through the tax payments and start working for themselves. Right? So Tax Freedom Day is calculated by taking total federal, state and local taxes and dividing national income to get a ratio representing the share of income the average person pays on all taxes, and it's applied to a 365-day calendar. And so apparently for this year, according to the Tax Freedom website, April the 17th is Tax Freedom Day, so it's for Americans, so it's 2 days ahead. All right, so if anyone's American here, you have to put on your red, white and blue socks or something. All right. We find a similar, that's Friedman's idea. You find similar kinds of ideas in Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, where he talks about self-ownership. And for those of you who've studied political philosophy, I won't go into it in great detail. And for those of you who haven't come across Nozick's work, I can just briefly say that he begins with the thought that we own our own bodies, and by mixing our labour with objects in the world, we come to own them. And what is fundamental to Nozick's system is the idea that we own our labour, and the government requisitioning of this necessarily involves unjustifiable, it's theft in a sense, and involves unjustifiable coercion. So you could see how somebody would develop an objection to the kinds of retirement proposals that Juhana's talking about in terms of Nozick's views. Oddly or interestingly, you get related views from Marxists, or some Marxists. The analytic Marxist Jerry Cohen, in a book called Self-Ownership, Freedom and Equality, argues that, he's not talking about retirement, but he does talk about self-ownership, And he thinks the best way to explicate Marx's claims about the exploitation of the working class is in terms of self-ownership. So probably, we can talk about that later if anybody wants to talk about it. But interesting, you can see how you might get an objection to this kind of proposal from the right, but you could also get one from the left, where people are talking about how self-ownership of workers means that the requisition of labour by governments and capitalists is such that any extension of the period of time when people work is morally legitimate. I think there are problems with talking in these ways. So the first, just to go back to the notion of ownership, and I won't go into this in great detail, but Tony Honore, article called Ownership, it was published in 1961, notes that ownership he sort of questions the assumption that ownership is a single right to the exclusive use and control of an object. Actually, interestingly, I discovered, I think, looks like Tony Honore is still alive. I don't know if anyone looking on the website, so, and still writing, so that's impressive, given how long he's been doing interesting work in this area. But his idea is that ownership is a bundle of rights. And it's a little bit like you don't have to have all the rights in order to have ownership, or you don't have to, at any one point, you don't have to have all the bundle of rights in order for it to be a form of ownership. Now, the point for our purposes is that ownership of one's labour does not mean that such ownership comes without social obligations, as I think the objection from ownership might seem to suggest. So the earlier, I put it rather bluntly and quickly, but there is a sense in that in the sense of the objection of ownership, that you own your ownership of anything, whether it's your own labour or property, always gives you exclusive rights to it, and that no social obligations come with it. The second, so that's one difficulty. A second difficulty has to do with the rather odd causal account, according to which ownership rights can exist prior to the provision of institutional prior to the existence of governmental institutions that provide the framework in which rights are able to be exercised. So, this interesting book Liam Murphy and Thomas Nagel wrote in 2004 called The Myth of Ownership, Taxation and Justice. And there they attack those who regard taxation as a governmental violation of pre-existing, pre-institutional property rights. According to Murphy and Nagel, our incomes are earned in a world with government, which is necessarily a world that has already had taxes in it. Without the legal and economic institutions supported by taxes that make a market economy possible, we'd have nothing, or at any rate nothing resembling what we have now. So they're saying, as the quote there says, what we have is not ours in any meaningful or, more importantly, justifiable sense. Instead, the distribution of property income is directly related to a host of government policies. The proper way to approach the analysis of tax policy, therefore, is to view it in the context of the general aims of government, underlined as they are by the basic philosophical arguments about the type of society in which we want to live. Basically, it's saying there isn't, it's not, the model that they're trying to attack is this idea that I own something, own my labour, and then the government comes in and suddenly taxes it. Right? It's like we're out in the bush, or whatever you call it here in Finland, whatever you call it, the bush. And I'm working away, and the government comes in like some marauding bush ranger and takes or imposes taxes on something. Their point is that you don't have anything in that sense without the government framework, and that framework is predicated upon the prior existence of taxes. Right, there's a further point you might wish to make here, and this is that the skills and capacities that we have in performing work are not something we have independently of society itself. This is not a point about the institutional framework, but the origins of the powers that we have, all right, that this idea of strong ownership seems to ignore. All right, so just think about the dialectic of this so far. We haven't gone a little bit, okay. Well, I'll hurry up. Okay, good. All I'm saying here is this objection doesn't hold much water. But does it justify? Just one other thing. we talked about opting out. I mean, we can come back to this later, but I think in a sense, opting out of this particular retirement deferral would look rather like free riding. We can talk about that again later. I think one of the things is try to justifying, okay, what I've done there is just criticise an objection, but how do you go about actually justifying these kinds of policies? Well, one way might be utilitarian justification, right? And I'm suggesting you can justify it within a social democratic framework. I'm told, and because I don't read the debates here, well, a lot of them I can't read, I'm told that there's a lot of hostility towards a lot of what Juhana's saying. So part of what I think is interesting here is to see how you might justify it within the social democratic framework. All right, so you could justify this with the utilitarian framework, but I don't want to do that. But what I want to do is just look at a distributive route. And I think we need to treat a longer working life as one of the burdens that now need to be dealt with when making decisions about the, so I should say proper, not ROPA, allocation of distributed benefits and burdens. Right. I think some of the audience will no doubt know that it's a tradition beginning with Aristotle of seeing distributive justice as covering the allocation of benefits and burdens. So instead of regarding it just as a harm, when I talked about it before, I was saying that retirement, extending the retirement age should be thought of as a harm. I think we need to think of it as a distributive burden that needs to be accommodated within practices that are compatible with the practices and ideals of social democracy. So no longer it's not so much a matter of justifying or objecting to this proposal, if the demographic information is right, but rather seeing it as part of an unavoidable background, as part of the unavoidable background, if you want to put it that way, of public policy making. So what does it mean to think about it as a distributed burden? Well, I think it carries with it the idea of it being an unavoidable feature of social life, for which all members of society are responsible. The question then is, okay, let's accept it's a distributed burden, it's background consideration in the decision making. How do we bring about policies in relationship to that are compatible with the ideals of social democracy and don't undermine it? I think that, and that's partly what you were pushing at before. I've just got a list here of what this is the report. There should be apostrophe there. Forgive me. There's three recommendations I think are interesting here, and this is where a lot of the debate about public policy is. The changing demographics underline the need to reduce benefit dependency and raise employment rates. Okay. The appendix spending pushes call for actions that define the core activities of the welfare state, set limits for what the government is responsible for, and enhance the efficiency of public services. And third thing there is the importance of investment in human capital and the young. So I think those are what that particular report's oriented towards. I've got some suggestions here, I think, which are basically just oriented, so I'll finish with this, and hopefully I'll have it. So it'll take me 2 or 3 minutes. I think the trick is, if we think of it as a distributed burden, we are going to have to deal with, I mean, it's true of most Western countries that there's an increase, we've got this demographic change that means that the base of people who create the wealth is diminishing. And if we want to maintain, a decent welfare system and a decent system of education for the future, then how do we go about financing it? And how do we do that in a way that's compatible with the kinds of ideals that people think are really important and are part of the social democracy? Well, I think the first one is, as I've already said, reconceptualise retirement deferral as a distributed burden. Right? It's not about justifying or objecting to it. It's a matter of seeing that as a background feature of public policy. I think also it needs to be accepted that it's a group responsibility which should be dealt with in line with the ideals of social democracy. So, and part of that, I mean, what that means is, if the burden can be made less burdensome through efficiency methods, then that is prima facie desirable. But those methods should not undermine the sense of commitment to the common good across the society, nor undermine measures that ensure all take responsibility for it. So I think it's important that everyone takes responsibility for these measures. More specifically, in adopting efficiency measures, which typically involve market solutions, these should not be promoted on the virtue parsimonious grounds that a system which relies on less virtue is preferable to one which relies on more, since this would undermine the commitment that is part of the success of the Nordic model and for most social democratic countries. So I think the point, and this does connect up with what Juhana was saying, it's not just that using markets can be seen as demeaning or economic incentives as demeaning, but it's also the consequence of that might be that people's commitment to the public economy can be undermined. And so part of what we need to do is to ensure that it's not a Trojan horse, that the use of market-based solutions isn't a Trojan horse for the endorsement of a framework that praises being parsimonious about concern for the common good. I think we should be, finally, so I'm nearly finished, we should avoid regarding the profit motive as the singular motive. Now, why do I say that? Well, all right, so the point before was about virtue parsimony, and it was about let's not allow the focus on market-based solutions to undermine the commitment to the public good. I think one point to be made about that also is that sometimes people have the Kantian thought that market norms and valuing something intrinsically are necessarily mutually exclusive. And I think in part we need to recognise there are cases where they're compossible. The danger is where markets corrode intrinsic value. And the fourth point here is avoid regarding the profit motive as a singular motive. And what I mean by this is that people talk about the profit motive, but in fact it's a range of motives. And sometimes people can pursue there's different versions of the profit motive. Some of them involve singularly pursuing money, and others have side constraints. Right? So one way you might think is moral side constraints. So people can pursue profit with moral side constraints. So I think it's important to be aware that those, when we bring in these market mechanisms, that those pursuing profit are encouraged to have and see the importance of those profit motives being side constrained by commitment to the common good and by commitment to the welfare of others. And final point here is just citizens' responsibilities and rights, and again there should be an apostrophe there. And I think just similarly, a lot of this focus is being put on to, a lot of the stress or the onus here is being put on to ordinary workers, and I think that it needs to be seen as a responsibility that's taken up by the society as a whole. One of the reasons that it's been successful, the Nordic model, is because it has been a compact between both business and the unions and other representatives of the working people. And if that was undermined, I think it would be a bad thing. But a lot of the pressure here needs to both, the pressure needs to be not only on citizens but also on business as well. Right, so I might just leave that there. Thanks.